This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. Mysticism, a study in nature and development of spiritual consciousness by Evelyn Underhill. First half of Part 2, Chapter 8. Ecstasy and Rapture. Since the object of all contemplation is the production of that state of intimate communion in which the mystics declare that the self is in God and God is in her, it might be supposed that the horizon of union represented the end of mystical activity, insofar as it is concerned with the attainment of a transitory but exalted consciousness of oneness with the Absolute. Nearly all the great contemplators, however, describe as a distinct and regard as a more advanced phase of the spiritual consciousness the group of definitely ecstatic states in which the concentration of interest on the transcendent is so complete, the gathering up and pouring out of life on this one point so intense, that the subject is more or less entranced, and becomes, for the time of the ecstasy, unconscious of the external world. In ordinary contemplation he refused to attend to that external world. It was there, a blurred image, at the fringe of his conscious field, but he deliberately left it on one side. In ecstasy he cannot attend to it. None of its messages reach him, not even those most insistent of all messages which are translated into the terms of bodily pain. All mystics agree in regarding such ecstasy as an exceptionally favorable state, the one in which man's spirit is caught up to the most immediate union with the divine. The word has become a synonym for joyous exaltation, for the inebriation of the infinite. The induced ecstasies of the Dionysian mysteries, the metaphysical raptures of the Neoplatonists, the voluntary or involuntary trance of Indian mystics and Christian saints, all these, however widely they may differ in transcendental value, agree in claiming such value, in declaring that this change in the quality of consciousness brought with it a valid and ineffable apprehension of the real. Clearly this apprehension will vary in quality and content with the place of the subject in the spiritual scale. The ecstasy is merely the psychophysical condition which accompanies it. It is hardly a paradox to say, says Myers, that the evidence for ecstasy is stronger than the evidence for any other religious belief. Of all the subjective experiences of religion, ecstasy is that which has been most urgently, perhaps the psychologist most convincingly, asserted, and it is not confined to any one religion. From the medicine man of the lowest savages up to St. John, St. Peter, and St. Paul, with Buddha and Muhammad on the way, we find records which, though morally and intellectually much differing, are in psychological essence the same. There are three distinct aspects under which the ecstatic state may be studied: A, the physical; B, the psychological; C, the mystical. Many of the deplorable misunderstandings and still more deplorable mutual recriminations which surround its discussion come from the refusal of experts in one of these three branches to consider the results arrived at by the other two. A. Physically considered, ecstasy is a trance, more or less deep, more or less prolonged. The subject may slide into it gradually from a period of absorption in, or contemplation of, some idea which has filled the field of consciousness, or it may come on suddenly, the appearance of the idea, or even some word or symbol suggesting the idea, abruptly throwing the subject into an entranced condition. This is the state which some mystical writers call rapture. The distinction, however, is a conventional one, and the works of the mystics describe many intermediate forms. During the trance, breathing and circulation are depressed. The body is more or less cold and rigid, remaining in the exact position which it occupied at the oncoming of the ecstasy, however difficult and unnatural this pose may be. Sometimes entrancement is so deep that there is complete anesthesia, as in the case which I quote from the life of St. Catherine of Siena. Credible witnesses report that Bernadette, the visionary of Lourdes, held the flaming end of a candle in her hand for 15 minutes during one of her ecstasies. She felt no pain, neither did the flesh show any marks of burning. Similar instances of ecstatic anesthesia abound in the lives of the saint, and are also characteristic of certain pathological states. The trance includes, according to the testimony of the ecstatics, two distinct phases: A, the short period of lucidity, and B, a longer period of complete unconsciousness, which may pass into a death-like catalepsy lasting for hours, or, as once with St. Teresa, for days. The difference between union and trance, says Teresa, is this, that the latter lasts longer and is more visible outwardly, because the breathing gradually diminishes so that it becomes impossible to speak or to open the eyes. And though this very thing occurs when the soul is in union, there is more violence in a trance, for the natural warmth vanishes, I know not how, when the rapture is deep. And in all these kinds of orison there is more or less of this. When it is deep, as I was saying, the hands become cold and sometimes stiff and straight as pieces of wood. As to the body, if the rapture comes on when it is standing or kneeling, it remains so. And the soul is so full of the joy of that which our Lord is setting before it, that it seems to forget to animate the body and abandons it. If the rapture lasts, the nerves are made to feel it. Such ecstasy as this, so far as its physical symptoms go, is not, of course, the peculiar privilege of the mystics. It is an abnormal bodily state, caused by a psychic state, and this causal psychic state may be healthy or unhealthy, the result of genius or disease. It is common in the little understood type of personality called sensitive or mediumistic. It is a well-known symptom of certain mental and nervous illnesses. A feeble mind concentrated on one idea, like a hypnotic subject gazing at one spot, easily becomes entranced, however trivial the idea which gained possession of his consciousness. Apart from its content, then, ecstasy carries no guarantee of spiritual value. It merely indicates the presence of certain abnormal psychophysical conditions, an alteration of the normal equilibrium, a shifting of the threshold of consciousness which leaves the body and the whole usual external world outside instead of inside the conscious field, and even affects those physical functions, such as breathing, which are almost entirely automatic. Thus ecstasy, physically considered, may occur in any person in whom 1. The threshold of consciousness is exceptionally mobile, and 2. There is a tendency to dwell upon one governing idea or intuition. Its worth depends entirely on the objective value of that idea or intuition. In the hysterical patient, thanks to an unhealthy condition of the centers of consciousness, any trivial or irrational idea, any one of the odds and ends stored up in the subliminal region, may thus become fixed, dominate the mind, and produce entrancement. Such ecstasy is an illness. The emphasis is on the pathological state which makes it possible. In the mystic, the idea which fills his life is so great a one, the idea of God, that in proportion as it is vivid, real, and intimate, it inevitably tends to monopolize the field of consciousness. Here the emphasis is on the overpowering strength of spirit, not on the feeble and unhealthy state of body or mind. This true ecstasy, says Godfreneau, is not a malady, but the extreme form of a state which must be classed amongst the ordinary accidents of conscious life. The mystics themselves are fully aware of the importance of this distinction. Ecstasies, no less than visions and voices, must, they declare, be subjected to unsparing criticism before they are recognized as divine. Whilst some are undoubtedly of God, others are no less clearly of the devil. The great doctors of the mystic life, says Malaval, teach that there are two sorts of rapture, which must be carefully distinguished. The first are produced in persons but little advanced in the way, and still full of selfhood, either by the force of a heated imagination, which vividly apprehends a sensible object, or by the artifice of the devil. These are the raptures which St. Teresa calls, in various parts of her works, raptures of feminine weakness. The other sort of rapture is, on the contrary, the effect of pure intellectual vision in those who have a great and generous love for God. To generous souls who have utterly renounced themselves, God never fails in these raptures to communicate high things. All the mystics agree with Malival in finding the test of a true ecstasy not in its outward sign, but in its inward grace, its after-value. And here psychology would do well to follow their example. The ecstatic states, which are supreme instances of the close connection between body and soul, have bodily as well as mental results, and those results are as different and as characteristic as those observed in healthy and in morbid organic processes. If the concentration has been upon the highest centre of consciousness, the organ of spiritual perception, if a door has really been opened by which the self has escaped for an instant to the vision of that which is, the ecstasy will be good for life. The entrancement of disease, on the contrary, is always bad for life. Its concentration being upon the lower instead of the higher levels of mentality, it depresses rather than enhances the vitality, the fervour, or the intelligence of its subject, and leaves behind it an enfeebled will, and often moral and intellectual chaos. Ecstasies that do not produce considerable profit either to the persons themselves or others deserve to be suspected, says Augustine Baker, and when any marks of their approaching are perceived, the persons ought to divert their minds some other way. It is the difference between a healthy appetite for nourishing food and a morbid craving for garbage. The same organs of digestion are used in satisfying both, yet he would be a hardy physiologist who undertook to discredit all nutrition by a reference to its degenerate forms. Sometimes both kinds of ecstasy, the healthy and the psychopathic, are seen in the same person. Thus, in the cases of St. Catherine of Genoa and St. Catherine of Siena, it would seem that as their health became feebler, and the nervous instability always found in persons of genius increased, their ecstasies became more frequent. But these were not healthy ecstasies, such as those which they experienced in the earlier stages of their careers, and which brought with them an access of vitality. They were the results of increasing weakness of body, not of the overpowering strength of the spirit, and there is evidence that Catherine of Genoa, that acute self-critic, was conscious of this. Those who attended on her did not know how to distinguish one state from the other, and hence on coming to she would sometimes say, "Why did you let me remain in this quietude from which I have almost died?" Her earlier ecstasies, on the contrary, had in a high degree the positive character of exaltation and life enhancement consequent upon extreme concentration on the Absolute, as well as the merely negative character of annihilation of the surface consciousness. She came from them with renewed health and strength, as from a resting in heavenly places and a feeding on heavenly food, and side by side with this ecstatic life fulfilled the innumerable duties of her active vocation as hospital matron and spiritual mother of a large group of disciples. Many times, says her legend, she would hide herself in some secret place and there stay, and being sought she was found upon the ground, her face hidden in her hands, altogether beyond herself, in such a state of joy as is beyond thought or speech. And being called, yea, even in a loud voice, she heard not, and at other times she would go up and down, as if beyond herself, drawn by the impulse of love, she did this. And certain other times she remained for the space of 6 hours as if dead, but hearing herself called, suddenly she got up, and answering she would at once go about all that needed to be done, even the humblest things. And in thus leaving the all, she went without any grief, because she fled all selfhood, la proprietà, as if it were the devil. And when she came forth from her hiding place, her face was rosy as it might be a cherub's, and it seemed as if she might have said, "Who shall separate me from the love of God?" Very often, says St. Teresa, describing the results of such rapturous communion with pure love as that from which St. Catherine came joyous and rosy-faced, he who was before sickly and full of pain comes forth healthy and even with new strength, for it is something great that is given to the soul in rapture. B. Psychologically considered, all ecstasy is a form, the most perfect form, of the state which is technically called complete monoideism, that withdrawal of consciousness from circumference to centre, that deliberate attention to one thing, which we discussed in recollection, is here pushed, voluntarily or involuntarily, to its logical conclusion. It is 1. Always paid for by psychophysical disturbances. 2. Rewarded in healthy cases by an enormous lucidity, a supreme intuition in regard to the one thing on which the self's interest has been set. Such ecstasy, then, is an exalted form of contemplation, and might be expected in appropriate subjects to develop naturally from that state. A simple difference of degree, says Maury, separates ecstasy from the action of forcibly fixing an idea in the mind. Contemplation implies exercise of will, and the power of interrupting the extreme tension of the mind. In ecstasy, which is contemplation carried to its highest pitch, the will, although in the strictest sense able to provoke the state, is nevertheless unable to suspend it. In complete monoideism, then, the attention to one thing and the inattention to all else is so entire that the subject is entranced. Consciousness has been withdrawn from those centres which receive and respond to the messages of the external world. He neither sees, feels, nor hears. The ego dormio et cor meum vigilat of the contemplative ceases to be a metaphor and becomes a realistic description. It must be remembered that the whole trend of mystical education has been toward the production of this fixity of attention. Recollection and quiet led up to it. Contemplation cannot take place without it. All the mystics assure us that a unification of consciousness, in which all outward things are forgot, is the necessary prelude of union with the divine. For consciousness of the many and consciousness of the one are mutually exclusive states. Ecstasy, for the psychologist, is such a unification in its extreme form. The absorption of the self in the one idea, the one desire, is so profound, and in the case of the great mystics, so impassioned, that everything else is blotted out. The tide of life is withdrawn, not only from those higher centres which are the seats of perception and of thought, but also from those lower centres which govern the physical life. The whole vitality of the subject is so concentrated on the transcendental world, or, in a morbid ecstatic, on the idea which dominates his mind, that body and brain alike are depleted of their energy in the interests of this supreme act. Since mystics have, as a rule, the extreme susceptibility to suggestions and impressions which is characteristic of artistic and creative types, it is not surprising that their ecstasies are often evoked, abruptly, by the exhibition of, or concentration upon, some loved and special symbol of the divine. Such symbols form the rallying points about which are gathered a whole group of ideas and intuitions. Their presence, sometimes the sudden thought of them, will be enough, in psychological language, to provoke a discharge of energy along some particular path. That is to say, to stir to life all those ideas and intuitions which belong to the self's consciousness of the Absolute, to concentrate vitality on them, and introduce the self into that world of perception of which they are, as it were, the material keys. Hence the profound significance of symbols for some mystics, their paradoxical clinging to outward forms, whilst declaring that the spiritual and intangible alone is real. For the Christian mystics, the sacraments and mysteries of faith have always provided such a point d'appui, and these often play a large part in the production of their ecstasies. For St. Catherine of Siena, and also very often for her namesake of Genoa, the reception of Holy Communion was the prelude to ecstasy. Julian of Norwich and St. Francis of Assisi became entranced whilst gazing on the crucifix. We are told of Denis the Carthusian that towards the end of his life, hearing the Veni Creator, or certain verses of the Psalms, he was at once wrapped in God and lifted up from the earth. Of St. Catherine of Siena, her biographer says that she used to communicate with such fervour that immediately afterwards she would pass into the state of ecstasy, in which for hours she would be totally unconscious. On one occasion, finding her in this condition, they, the Dominican friars, forcibly threw her out of the church at midday, and left her in the heat of the sun, watched over by some of her companions till she came to her senses. Another, catching sight of her in the church when she was in ecstasy, came down and pricked her in many places with a needle. Catherine was not aroused in the least from her trance, but afterwards, when she came back to her senses, she felt the pain in her body and perceived that she had thus been wounded. It is interesting to compare with this objective description the subjective account of ecstatic union which St. Catherine gives in her Divine Dialogue. Here, the deeper self of the mystic is giving in a dramatic form its own account of its inward experiences. Hence we see the inward side of that outward state of entrancement, which was all that onlookers were able to perceive. As usual in the dialogue, the intuitive perceptions of the deeper self are attributed by St. Catherine to the divine voice speaking in her soul. Oftentimes, through the perfect union which the soul has made with me, she is raised from the earth almost as if the heavy body became light. But this does not mean that the heaviness of the body is taken away, but that the union of the soul with me is more perfect than the union of the body with the soul. Wherefore the strength of the spirit, united with me, raises the weight of the body from the earth, leaving it as if immovable, and all pulled to pieces in the affection of the soul. Thou rememberest to have heard it said of some creatures, that were it not for my goodness, in seeking strength for them, they would not be able to live, and I would tell thee that, in the fact that the souls of some do not leave their bodies, is to be seen a greater miracle than in the fact that some have arisen from the dead. So great is the union which they have with me. I, therefore, sometimes for a space withdraw from the union, making the soul return to the vessel of her body, from which she was separated by the affection of love. From the body she did not depart, because that cannot be except in death. The bodily powers alone departed, becoming united to me through affection of love. The memory is full of nothing but me. The intellect, elevated, gazes upon the object of my truth. The affection, which follows the intellect, loves and becomes united with that which the intellect sees. These powers being united and gathered together and immersed and inflamed in me, the body loses its feeling, so that the seeing eye sees not, and the hearing ear hears not, and the tongue does not speak, except as the abundance of the heart will sometimes permit it, for the alleviation of the heart and the praise and glory of my name. The hand does not touch and the feet walk not, because the members are bound with the sentiment of love. A healthy ecstasy so deep as this seems to be the exclusive prerogative of the mystics, perhaps because so great a passion, so profound a concentration, can be produced by nothing smaller than their flaming love of God. But as the technique of contemplation is employed more or less consciously by all types of creative genius, by inventors and philosophers, by poets, prophets, and musicians, by all the followers of the Triple Star, no less than by the mystic saints, so too this apotheosis of contemplation, the ecstatic state, sometimes appears in a less violent form, acting healthily and normally in artistic and creative personalities at a complete stage of development. It may accompany the prophetic intuitions of the seer, the lucidity of the great metaphysician, the artist's supreme perception of beauty or truth. As the saint is caught up to God, so these are caught up to their vision, their partial apprehensions of the absolute life. Those joyous, expansive, outgoing sensations, characteristic of the ecstatic consciousness, are theirs also. Their greatest creations are translations to us, not of something they have thought, but of something they have known, in a moment of ecstatic union with the great life of the All. We begin then to think that the pure monoideism which the psychologist identifies with ecstasy, though doubtless a part, is far from being the whole content of this state. True, the ecstatic is absorbed in his one idea, his one love. He is in it and with it. It fills his universe. But this unified state of consciousness does not merely pour upon something already possessed. When it only does this, it is diseased. Its true business is pure perception. It is outgoing, expansive. Its goal is something beyond itself. The rearrangement of the psychic self which occurs in ecstasy is not merely concerned with the normal elements of consciousness. It is rather a temporary unification of consciousness round that centre of transcendental perception which mystics call the apex or the spark of the soul. Those deeper layers of personality which normal life keeps below the threshold are active in it, and these are fused with the surface personality by the governing passion, the transcendent love which lies at the basis of all sane ecstatic states. The result is not merely a mind concentrated on one idea, nor a heart fixed on one desire, nor even a mind and a heart united in the interests of a beloved thought, but a whole being welded into one, all its faculties, neglecting their normal universe, grouped about a new centre, serving a new life, and piercing, like a single flame, the barriers of the sensual world. Ecstasy is the psychophysical state which may accompany this brief synthetic act. C. Therefore, whilst on its physical side ecstasy is an entrancement, on its mental side a complete unification of consciousness, on its mystical side it is an exalted act of perception. It represents the greatest possible extension of the spiritual consciousness in the direction of pure being. The blind intent stretching here receives its reward in a profound experience of eternal life. In this experience, the departmental activities of thought and feeling, the consciousness of I-hood, of space and time, all that belongs to the world of becoming and our own place therein, are suspended. The vitality which we are accustomed to split amongst these various things is gathered up to form a state of pure apprehension, a vivid intuition of, or, if you like, conjunction with, the transcendent. For the time of his ecstasy, the mystic is, for all practical purposes, as truly living in the supersensual world as the normal human animal is living in the sensual world. He is experiencing the highest and most joyous of those temporary and unstable states, those passive unions, in which his consciousness escapes from the limitations of the senses, rises to freedom, and is united for an instant with the great life of the all. Ecstasy, then, from the contemplative's point of view, is the development and completion of the horizon of union, and he is not always at pains to distinguish the two degrees, a fact which adds greatly to the difficulties of students. In both states, though he may, for want of better language, describe his experience in terms of sight, the transcendent is perceived by contact, not by vision. As, enfolded in darkness with one whom we love, we obtain a knowledge far more complete than that conferred by the sharpest sight, the most perfect mental analysis. In ecstasy, the apprehension is perhaps more definitely beatific than in the horizon of union. Such memory of his feeling state as the ecstatic brings back with him is more often concerned with an exultant certainty, a conviction that he has known for once the reality which hath no image, and solved the paradox of life, than with meek self-loss in that cloud of unknowing, where the contemplative in union is content to meet his beloved. The true note of ecstasy, however, its only valid distinction from infused contemplation, lies in entrancement, in being ravished out of fleshly feeling, as St. Paul caught up to the third heaven, not in the lifting of mind unto God. This, of course, is an outward distinction only, and a rough one at that, since entrancement has many degrees, but it will be found the only practical basis of classification. Probably none but those who have experienced these states know the actual difference between them. Even St. Teresa's psychological insight fails her here, and she is obliged to fall back on the difference between voluntary and involuntary absorption in the divine, a difference not in spiritual values, but merely in the psychophysical constitution of those who have perceived these values. I wish I could explain with the help of God, she says, wherein union differs from rapture, or from transport, or from flight of the spirit, as they call it, or from trance, which are all one. I mean that all these are only different names for that one and the same thing, which is also called ecstasy. It is more excellent than union, the fruits of it are much greater, and its other operations more manifold. For union is uniform in the beginning, the middle, and the end, and is so also interiorly. But as raptures have ends of a much higher kind, they produce effects both within and without, i.e., both physical and psychical. A rapture is absolutely irresistible, whilst union, inasmuch as we are then on our own ground, may be hindered, though that resistance be painful and violent. End of first half of Part 2, Chapter 8.